my grandfather's life in the time before he arrived in the United States, to try to peer into that part of his life when he lived on the fringes of recorded officialdom. He started out on the lonely north side of an Azorean island far out in the Atlantic Ocean as part of an already marginalized population, almost completely beneath the notice of the central government and merely brushed upon by any anecdotal family stories. For such was the lot of a Portuguese peasant living on São Miguel in the late 1800s and early 1900s. That life took him on a voyage from the Azores to Brazil and back again, with a hint of exotic, unknown destinations in between. Do you want me to read the bio? Oops, I can't hear. Tim?
Just a minute here. I'm struggling with two audio streams overlapping, and I think I just solved it.
Would you like me to read the little bio on Al too?
Sure, go ahead. Okay. Yeah.
Al Moniz is a longtime Falmouth resident who took an interest in the life and times of his grandfather. Moniz has made a minor hobby of studying Portuguese history, as well as his own personal family history, and has made note of how these two threads seem to interweave with each other. A short play, A Brief History of the Portuguese, won him a Portuguese Heritage Award from the State House.
Thank you. Al, it's all yours. Go ahead. You just say whatever you wish at the beginning and go ahead and share your screen and we will roll with the plan, okay?
We'll start with a bom dia. How's that?
Good
day, Portuguese. Share screen?
Sure.
Okay.
Oh, you know what? I have to allow that, don't I?
That's what I see here.
There you go. Go ahead.
All right. So let's see. Do I escape from this here, from the Zoom? And I look for the PowerPoint. You getting this now?
Yeah, you need to, have you shared your screen yet?
I thought I had. Let's go back to the meeting. Share screen. Ah, there we go. Share. There. You seeing that?
Yes, and now you can, yeah, select the.
There we go.
The projector mode. There you go.
Cue music. A little louder. My interest and investigation into my grandfather's life and times began in earnest back in the spring of 1999. So, yeah, not that long ago. What sparked this late blooming interest? Well, I was asked by my second cousin, Beverly Williams, to make a presentation about grandfather myself and my brother were asked, at a family reunion that Beverly was organizing for June of that same year. The first thing I thought when she asked me was, I really don't know that much about Grandfather Moniz. I didn't think I knew any more than Beverly did. I think the reason she had asked me was because a few years before that, I had researched my other grandfather, my maternal grandfather, Joaquim Figueredo, who worked for the Beebes for 25 years. And I found much information about him, ended up making a presentation. Beverly had seen that, and so now she wanted me to do the other grandfather. In spite of the fact that I didn't know that much, I took it as a challenge to see what I could find. And so I said yes. I wanted to test the skills and the tools that I had honed in my investigation, in my research, into my exploration into Grandpa Fig. Now, as you can see by this poster here, I think it's from the Coonamessett River Preserve. I think it's a new poster. A lot, as of late, has been uncovered or revisited about the Portuguese that settled in T-Ticket in East Falmouth in the early 1910, 19 to 1930, how they came here, the strawberry growing they did. And my cousin Miguel, who's also quoted on this poster, it turns out, had done some wonderful research documenting Grandpa Jose Moniz's life and times already. But everything he concentrated on and found out dated from the time Jose first turned up in Falmouth in a census in 1910. My grandfather, it turns out, was quite the wheeler dealer and an innovator in the industry of strawberries in T-Ticket in the early 1900s. As you can see, he's listed prominently on this poster. He gets a credit. So that part, I felt there was no further need to explore. My cousin Miguel had more than covered that. What I soon became interested in were the years before Grandpa Joe got to America. This is the 1910 census, where we know that we can see that he's already in the United States. Let's see here if I can zero in on that part of it. No, not there. Well, it is a 1910 census. I'm still going to try. I'm going to go up, over here. Oh, we got the dates. There you go, 1910. But the time before that, all we had was a birth year, 1877, off of his tombstone at the graveyard at St. Anthony's in East Falmouth. This time between 1877 and 1910 became, in my mind, the lost years. There was, let's see. This is a time when we had virtually no records and a meager amount of family stories. It was those years shrouded in the mists of time and distance, crossing language and cultural barriers that I felt were the most fertile for discovery and imagination. And they were also the hardest to penetrate. So of course, that's where I headed. I had mentioned before that I had researched my other grandfather, Joaquim Figueredo, who also ended up in Falmouth. The things that I found as I was researching this and looking into it there were some aspects of my maternal grandfather that made it easier for me to do the research. For one thing, he was from mainland Portugal, which was very rare amongst the immigrant population in the local area. Almost all the other local Portuguese immigrants hailed from the Azores. So it was not such a big field of people, or it was easier to zero in on my grandfather's Euclid. Let's see what else. I found them on passenger lists. You could access Portuguese mainland, the records from the Continente, mainland Portugal, through the LDS church back in those days. Jose Moniz, on the other hand, we knew from the family stories, was from San Miguel in the Azores. I never had been able to, while I was researching my other grandfather, I thought it might be interesting to see what I could find out about Jose. This is about 4 or 5 years ago. Could never find him on any passenger lists. I also find you were unable to access Azorian marriage and baptismal records through the LDS, Latter-day Saints records at that time. So Grandpa Joe was a lot more of a challenge. As I said a few minutes ago, most of the early Portuguese immigrants to the United States were from the Azores. I've seen numbers of about up to 90% of the Portuguese in Southeast Mass and Rhode Island originally came from the Azores. Now, on top of that, not only was he from this large group of immigrants, but Jose Moniz is virtually the Portuguese equivalent of John Smith. With no other identifying marker, there was no way to know which Jose was which. Now, this is a 1930s census record, and I'm just showing you it because it's for East Falmouth, and over here we have a bunch of family names, and you can see their places of origins are the Azores, the Azores, the Azores, the Azores, the Azores, and a couple of Lisbon, and the Azores, 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 Azores. This is just to reaffirm that premise that it was going to be more a needle in a haystack to find Jose Moniz. Let's start with the Azores. The Azores, if you don't know, are a group of islands about a third of the way between mainland Europe and the United States, off the coast of Portugal, first discovered or rediscovered by the Portuguese in 1420, 1430. They populated it. It has Portuguese culture, but it was always treated as kind of a province, or not completely as part of the mainland Portuguese culture. There were 9 islands in the Azores. San Miguel is the largest. That is where that's where my grandfather Jose came from. Now, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on one early record that we did have. This is a baptismal record of my oldest uncle, Uncle Teoff, we called him. His actual name was Theophilus, which always struck us, and may strike you, as being an odd name. It is an atypical Portuguese first name. It is a unique Portuguese first name. I don't think it is a Portuguese first name. Stories from our family would indicate it's a Greek first name. How did my oldest uncle, my grandfather's firstborn, get the name Theophilus? Well, that's a story we're going to touch upon later. Right now, I'm picking this document because it was, at the time I started this investigation about a year ago, it was the only document we had that was from the old country. This is a baptismal record that my cousin Beverly had and shared with me. And it has a lot of information that can help me, kind of try to penetrate back into the days of my grandfather before he came to this country. I'm not so adept with this Nope, that ain't happening. I'm going to try and zoom in on.
Yeah, you drag it. Once it's magnified,
There
you
we
drag
go. There we go. So let's look at this part right here. This registration comes from the district of Ribeira Grande in the Azores. And according to that, the parish of Luma de Maya is where it took place. Here is San Miguel. We find Luma de Maya, a quaint little village on the rugged northern coast of San Miguel. That place places him on this remote northern side of the island. Now, when we go back to the record, you can also see that my grandfather's name on this record is given as Jose Moniz Catunto. The name Catunto leaped out at me when I saw it in this record. I had heard this name as a youth. It was kind of floating around in the background. I never knew how it was attached. It kind of was like a little a little cloud, or it was like a hint or an echo that sort of was around my grandfather and his name. I always took it as a nickname and didn't think any more of it than that. However, again, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and my father, Adeline Moniz's last days, I would visit him regularly just to spend time with him. However, sometimes the visits kind of dragged as we didn't have topics to converse on. So I got the idea of asking my father in that time, while he was still here, about any stories he might have had about the old country and our family. How about Catunta? I asked him. Where did this name Catunta come from? Was it a nickname? If it was a nickname, what did it mean? So my dad told me this story I had never heard before. That was this. On the northern side of San Miguel, when my grandfather was a boy, maybe a teenager, there was a rock off the coastline that my grandfather swam around that no one else could and no one else did. He was the only person who ever made it to that rock. And I thought, or said, cool story. So he's kind of a daredevil. But what does that have to do with Catunta? And my father said, the name of the rock was something like Pata do Catunta. So my grandfather earned this name as maybe like a rite of passage by doing this daredevil thing. That was just one of the earliest stories I had from the old country. However, there were a bunch of, this is how I imagine that rock off the coast. There were problems with this story. For one thing, there were also echoes of other family and other branches in California and Canada that still kept the name Catunta, which apparently my grandfather had dropped when he had arrived in this country. How could his cousins have the name Catunta if this was something my grandfather had gotten attached to him specifically? Well, since nobody else in the family had ever heard the story, I just racked it up as a colorful tale and left it at that. But it's going to come into play later. Like I said, the northern coast of San Miguel is where he grew up, my grandfather. On the northern side of the island in the late 1800s, it's safe to say that while the island landscape was beautiful, life was otherwise hard. Well, it was a hard life for anyone who didn't own land, and circumstances, and now I also have document, make it very evident my grandfather did not own land, a kind of subsistence sharecropping feudal economic system of leasing land and sharing most of the profit with an absentee landlord was pretty much the only game in town. There was very little hope of advancement with no real possibility of bettering your lot in life on that part of the Azores. So let's look here on the record again, and we see Jose Moniz Catunto, and we have Der Proficio. That's his profession, a word I don't recognize. But fortunately, this document came with a Google translation. If you look at the translation, we talk about Theophilus, legitimate son of Jose Moniz Catunta, who worked in the profession of cattle peasant. So there it is right on the document. He's a peasant. Now, like I said, and as I read other places, if you were a peasant in those days in the 1890s, you probably had to leave the island. As this professor from the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth is quoted as saying, there were 100,000 more people in the Azores in that time than there are today. Like I said before, it's on the perimeter of the Portuguese government. They were often disregarded. They had an expression, work from sun to sun, meaning from sun up to sundown. Pretty much, if you wanted any sort of future, you had to leave. All right, back to our document again. Let's look here. Said before, the name Theophilus. That takes us on the next part of our journey. My grandfather, let's see here. According to family tradition, he was in the Azores in 1905, but he hadn't always been there. The story is that Grandpa had already been to America and back once by that time. Only the America he had been to was not North America, it was South America. The story was that he had gone from the Azores to São Paulo, Brazil, sometime in the late 1890s, early 1900s. He had worked in São Paulo on a coffee plantation. He worked as an indentured servant. He worked as an indentured servant just to pay for his passage over to Brazil. That's how badly he wanted to get out. On the plantation, the story goes, my grandfather had made a friend. As Theophilus Moniz Jr. had said to me, Theophilus Moniz Jr. is a cousin, also known as Cousin Red. In his version of the story, things on that plantation were bad. Really bad. Now, slavery had only recently been abolished in Brazil, and the population there was still treated as virtual slaves. I mean, not the population. On the plantation, the labor was treated virtually as slaves. I imagine the atmosphere there was pretty much every man for himself. The place was full of other badasses and desperados who had no better prospects back from their home countries. Most of the workers were from Portugal because there was apparently a pipeline that had indentured servants being funneled to Brazil from the Azores. But they weren't entirely from the Azores or Portugal. Apparently some were from Greece too, because Grandpa's friend in the story was named Theophilus. Theo and Jose, the story goes, helped each other in those tough times. They had each other's backs. My grandfather vowed if he ever lived through that experience, he would never forget Theophilus. When he made it back to the Azores, sometime around 1903 or 4, he kept his vow. He named his firstborn son after this friend. Back on the plantation, with help from friend Theo, Grandpa Jose finally finished his 5-year commitment. On the last day of the 5 years, the story went, he walked up to the foreman, punched him in the mouth, and walked off the grounds penniless. According to this version of the story, he never saw Theophilus again. Now he was on his own, wandering the streets of Sao Paulo. No work and no prospects. But that is when fate shone upon him. And through serendipity, he randomly ran into a wealthy plantation owner, another plantation owner, a kind man. I like to call this fellow the benevolent plantation owner. This plantation owner took my grandfather in and, according to the story, treated him almost like a son. He made Grandpa his foreman. And then, after a couple of years, had actually given him a parcel of his own land. My grandfather sold the land and used the money to return to the Azores. This part was much to my father's chagrin, because as he told it, the land my grandfather had sold is now part of downtown Sao Paulo. Or when he told the story in the 1960s, it was downtown Sao Paulo. That land would have been worth a small fortune. I could tell that my dad had dreamt often about how different his own life would have been if Grandpa Joe had just held on to that land. Be that as it may, this story is common to all branches of my family. There were variations on it, but generally it was the same story. In some of the other versions, the rich, benevolent plantation owner was the one named Theophilus. And that was the one who was honored with the first son's name. Either way, Jose returned to the Azores, where he soon thereafter marries, has a child, and returns to America again. This time, USA America, story ends. Or does it? Back to those visits I paid to my dad in his later years. One of those visits, I quizzed my dad again more about Grandpa Joe. Why had he left the Azores in the first place? How was it that he had gone to Brazil? What did my father know about his father's life back in the old country? Besides the story about the Catunta Rock and Theophilus, what did my dad know about my grandfather's youth? And this is when he told me a story I'd never heard before, another story I'd never heard before. In this story, when my grandfather Jose was a teenager back in the Azores, he had gotten into some kind of trouble. Some undefined trouble. Or he became known as a troublemaker. He had been sent away. Where? I asked my father. Well, he'd been sent from San Miguel to some island, my father said. Some island further out, he said. Further out in the Azores, I said? Yeah, I guess. Could have been. I'm thinking maybe it was Flores, the furthest island away, sparsely populated. Perhaps that's where they sent troublemakers in those days. But still, all the research I did and questions I asked, nobody had ever heard of somebody being sent from one Azorean island, which was pretty much already out in the middle of nowhere, to yet another Azorean island. That's when I began to ask around, for the sake of the family reunion, some other members of the family. They, in turn, had heard the same story about Grandpa Joe being some kind of undesirable, a rabble rouser, a troublemaker. Yes, but almost in a political sense, like an agitator. And their story had it that he was sent from the Azores to the Cape Verde Islands. Oh, this is interesting, I'm thinking. This is something new, something I never heard of. Apparently all this happened before the Brazil story. I wonder how this all fits together. But again, when I did research, I could never find any reference to somebody being sent from the Azores to the Cape Verde Islands as a kind of timeout, let's call it. After getting frustrated for a while, I decided to try a different tact. Here, oh, wait a minute, let's see. I started to look around online, on the web, and I found a Facebook page called São Miguel Genealogy. This was a page where you could access people living in São Miguel. You could get local knowledge. You could go right to the source. And I started posting questions. Have you ever heard of anybody from São Miguel being sent to Cape Verde Islands as part of a punishment? And I got a few non sequitur answers. People saying things like, well, we never have any crime on São Miguel, so it's a kind of a moot question. And I thought, well, this was back in the 1890s, and I'm starting to change my opinion about my grandfather. Or, you know, he's a troublemaker, but maybe it was just because he's somebody who spoke up or something. That's when I got a very intriguing reply on this Facebook page. A fellow replied to me and he said, if your grandfather was sent away, got in trouble in the 1890s in São Miguel, he must have most certainly been sent to Sao Tome. Sao Tome, never heard of it. What is Sao Tome? And turns out Sao Tome and Principe are yet another set of deserted islands the Portuguese had discovered when they started doing their exploring, starting in 1420s and 30s, when they started with the Azores, and they had worked their way down the African coast, finding Cape Verde Islands next, and then these islands, which were even further south than the Cape Verdean Islands. Now, I figured it was going to be hopeless to try to get records or some kind of documentary confirmation that my grandfather might have been sent to this place. So I decided to kind of shift gears and go into the big picture, to go into what was the history of this area in this times, the big picture, the general history. So when I started reading about it, I found some really intriguing parallels. As you can see here, most of the early inhabitants were undesirables, sent from Portugal. There's that word again. They were also could have been convicts, so it was used as a penitentiary destination. In the 19th century, two new cash crops were presented, coffee and cocoa. Hey, my grandfather worked on coffee plantations in São Paulo. Sort of intriguing parallels started to present themselves. Portuguese companies and landlords bought up the farmland and made these giant plantation systems. Turns out that the plantation owners that owned plantations in São Tomé off the African coast were some of the same plantation owners that owned plantations in Sao Paulo, Brazil. These plantation owners had a high degree of authority, led to abuses against the farm workers. Like I said, in 1876, slavery had been outlawed, but was simply replaced with a similar system of forced labor for low wages. Sounds like indentured servants. In the 1890s, there was a boom in the cocoa bean price. So they needed even more workers on São Tomé. The living conditions there, well, they started getting indentured laborers. Again, a lot of parallels to the story I heard about my grandfather going to Brazil. São Tomé, a tropical kind of island where you see similar pictures of people working the coffee plantation. But I could do nothing than find circumstantial evidence. This was only a supposition or a possibility. This intriguing idea that my grandfather might have been sent to São Tomé before he went to Brazil. It stayed there until the family reunion event in June 1999. Talking about the stories about the name Theophilus, the trip to Brazil, a couple of family members at this event told me yet another version of the Theophilus story. Okay, let's see. According to this version, the benevolent plantation owner and the way my grandfather had returned to the Azores was like this. While he was clearing rainforest, my grandfather had been bitten by a cobra. He had taken deathly ill and was nursed back to health by native healers. The good owner, plantation owner, had then sent him back to the Azores for further recovery. The proof of this that my other family members had was Grandpa Joe had a big chunk out of the calf of one of his legs. And the story he told is that is where the bite had been. And that's where they had cut his leg to suck the poison out of his body. Wow. Cool story. But again, now I had another puzzle piece I had to fit in with the stories of my grandfather being sent away, with the stories of my grandfather having been an indentured servant in Brazil. How did São Tomé fit into that? How did this story of my grandfather being bit by a cobra while he was in Brazil fit into that? Then I started to wonder. I looked online again. Do they have cobras in Brazil? Turns out, no. The answer is there are no cobras in South America. Cobras only live in Africa and Asia. So then I started thinking, or a cousin recommended to me, they said, why don't you look on São Tomé? So here we go. Another reference I find, there are 7 amphibian species native to São Tomé, 6 frogs, and 1 cobra bobo. Now I had my smoking gun. I had some physical evidence that connected my grandfather to São Tomé. I still didn't know the chronological sequence. I still didn't know if he had been sent, although I imagine he had gotten into trouble on the Azores as a late teenager. He had acted up. He had acted out. He had bucked against the system. At the same time, there were Oh, there was a need on San Tome for workers. They couldn't use slaves anymore, but there was money to be made and the plantation owners had influence. So now, could it be that the government was grabbing people off the street that they didn't like having around, charging them with something, sending them to San Tome to work their time off in the plantations? Could then somehow a plantation owner notice that my grandfather was a hard worker or had an ability in management, some kind of an innate ability? There was already connection, as you can see from the slave routes here, between that part of Africa and San Tome in Brazil. There was a connection already established. Don't know. But everything here, I had found out more, had some evidence, and had these pieces, had more pieces, had more colorful stories than I had. So now I'm going to go back to my handwritten notes and go into one more area. I felt like I probably exhausted as far as I could, whatever I could find out about my grandfather. We found the Katunta name with a story that was inconclusive. We had found the San Tome reference with a story that's inconclusive. We had found the Theopolis Brazil story. That one I'm pretty much sure of. There was enough corresponding stories within the family to kind of make you feel like you had enough sources. There was one other area that a cousin had once mentioned to me about how my grandfather had two unmarried sisters back in the Azores. And he had been sending money to them periodically. Didn't know how I was ever going to be able to find family back in the Azores until a really serendipitous, fortuitous event happened. Somebody on the website of Genealogy San Miguel had seen my questions reference Luma de Maya, and they had messaged me on Facebook that if I wanted to find out more about the village of Luma de Maya, I should go back to the Facebook page and come down on the drop-down menu to this item on the left called Files. So, if you want to do a little experiment with me right now, we can visit that particular web page. I'm going to escape this. Over here. I'm going to go to Genealogies, San Miguel. I'm going to come down to files that somebody had given me a lead on, asked for after I'd given up all hope. I click on files. What do I get? I start finding a bunch of records, Excel spreadsheets of records from San Miguel. Weddings, baptisms. Look here, Luma de Maya baptisms. Wrong time frame, but we're getting warmer. I click see. You know, my grandfather was born in 1877. That from the gravestone and from the various census records. Are you guys still with me here? Should I
Yeah,
keep?
Al, do you need to minimize your PowerPoint screen? We're still seeing the Facebook page.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Do you? I don't know.
Here we go. Are you seeing what I'm seeing on the Luma de Maya?
I see the picture from the San Miguel genealogy web page. That's part of your PowerPoint presentation.
Okay. Well, I would like to go to the live San Miguel page now.
So minimize that for a moment. Right
I'm
there. Just-
minimizing that.
You have to choose the application with Zoom. He's
Oh,
chosen
okay.
to share PowerPoint. He just needs to reselect which application to share. So if you go back to share desktop, then choose the
Oh.
other application that he's using to browse.
So do I go to new share here?
Yes.
All right, I go to new share and I'm going here. Is this the live one? Is this the live one?
That's close. You've changed what you're sharing, but it's not what
No.
you want yet.
All
We see
right,
your
I'm
mouse
going
at
back to
least.
PowerPoint. I'm going over to PowerPoint. I'm going to
Yeah,
go to
make the selection of what you were
new
sharing.
share. Here we go. I see it now. All right,
There you go. Yeah.
files. I clicked on files. I started finding these Excel spreadsheets. I'm coming down the spreadsheets. I'm finding Luma de Maya weddings. I'm looking for baptismal records. Looking for baptismal records. Luma de Maya baptisms. Here we go. Luma de Maya baptisms 1870 through 1879. Getting warmer. I open it up. Here's the spreadsheet. I expand it out. It's very clear, all translated. Everything has been presented to me on a platter. Thank you, whoever you are who did this, because I've gone to Portuguese baptismal records directly before, and I have a hell of a time trying to decipher the handwriting, translate the words. We can see here now that we started in 1870, and I'm scrolling down, scrolling down, scrolling down. I got 1877. I'm hoping I can find my grandfather. Well, there's not a huge amount of names here, so maybe I can make it. I'm coming down 1870. I'm coming down 1870. I'm up to 72, 73. I'm getting closer. 74, almost there. 75, 76, maybe one more page down. Just want to take you through the moment when I actually came across this and how it works on the Facebook page. I'm coming down to 1877. I'm starting to look down here on the child's name who was baptized. I come across Jose. We got March 11th, 1877. His parents are Manuel Moniz, Catunto, and Maria Rosa, just like they are on the baptismal records. I found them. I got them. I got the record. From this, I can find out who his grandfathers and grandmother were, who her grandmother and grandfather were. From this, I need to come back here. Need to go back to the PowerPoint, screen sharing. Up here, I'm coming here. I want to do the screen sharing again. How come it won't let me do that? New share. I want to go back to the PowerPoint. Here I am. Open that up. Is that there for you guys?
That's it.
Okay. Now I want to come down here. I want to do the full screen on this. Oh, got to go all the way up to where we are, present time. Recap the whole story here. Take you up to finally at the end where I'm accessing records on a website. Here they are. I found. Now, did I find Jose? There he is. I had the name Catunto already. It all matches up. The reason that was important, I want to go back to like 1875 there. And we find, here's another Jose. Guess what? He also has a father named Manuel Moniz. If I didn't have the Katunta, I don't think it would have been as easy to pinpoint my grandfather. You can see below him, there's another fellow, Antonia, and his father was Manuel Moniz. There are so many Manuel Monizes here. Again, I would have been back to the needle in the haystack unless I had that name Katunto. Katunto turned out to be important because it allowed me to navigate the records back in the old country. All kind of fed in. However, we can see that my grandfather, his father also had the name Katunto. That would have seemed to be the final clincher in getting rid of the story of the swimming to the rock, that romantic story. Now, I'm going to go through I went through some other trial and error where I tried to find other records on these lists. First one I tried to find was my great-grandfather. I just did a guesstimate that if he was having a son in 1877, he might have been 22 years old, 23. So I started looking at baptismal records in 1850s, mid 1850s, see if I could find my great-grandfather. No luck. So then I tried to find younger brothers and sisters of my grandfather. Again, no luck. So then I kind of shifted gears. I don't know why I thought he would be one of the oldest of his family. I started working the other way. And pretty soon I started finding siblings with surprising regularity. In 74, we find a Mariano. I found a Mariano. 72, I found a Maria number 3. These numbers started to make me wonder too. Were children not surviving childbirth? 70, we got a Rosa 2. 67, we got a Manuel 2. 66, we got another Manuel. Manuel 1, I guess. Then something super interesting happened in 65. I don't think I'm going to take you through the records. I'm just going to tell you about it. If you look at 66, my grandfather, his father, his grandfather all had the name Katunta attached to them. When we get to 65, going with the pattern, it fits in the time frame. I find a Manuel Moniz's, I find a Rosa born to Manuel Moniz and a Rosa Moniz, a Maria Rosa. The grandparents and all the rest line up, except for the name Katunto is no longer there. If I continue back earlier, again, I see the pattern maintaining, but I see the name Katunta is lost. The records seem to indicate the name Katunto appeared in the family line, appeared in the lineage between 1865 and 1866. And then it was applied retroactively. It was applied from the children to Manuel Moniz, my great-grandfather, and to his father, my great-great-grandfather. They all became Katunto after that point, but they weren't Katunto before that point. Somehow the name was Katunto was added. Could some family member have been the one to swim to that rock? I don't know. But it's intriguing to hear the stories and then find documentation that seemed to give some sort of credence to it. Last thing I found was that my great-grandfather, Manuel, his bride were married in 1849. There was a note on this record that the groom, meaning my great-grandfather, is the widow of Francisca de Jesus. So it turns out these records didn't stop there. My great-grandfather had been married a first time. There were yet more offspring, stepbrothers and sisters of my grandfather. Turns out that my grandfather came from a large family, a gigantic family. He was the last born of this family. All this stuff none of us ever knew. If I think about how this applies to his life and what we know of him in T-Ticket in East Falmouth in 1915, 1920, 1930s, when he was active in the strawberry growing industry, when he was an entrepreneur and an innovator, we see perhaps being the youngest, the last of this tribe, maybe he had to fend for himself. Maybe he had to hustle a little bit more. Maybe he had to scrap a little harder to get that piece of food and keep himself alive. If the story about swimming to the rock is true, in the line, there must have been a line of risk takers. They went a little further and they went a little more daringly out into the world. From the story about him being a troublemaker, an agitator, kind of indicates he wouldn't accept the status quo. That's perhaps why he was forced to leave, and that's why he left. We can see he worked in commercial scale agriculture, working on gigantic plantations in Brazil, at least, perhaps on San Tome. In the story of the benevolent plantation owner, he is made a foreman and given a reward of some land. Perhaps he showed a talent even back then as a leader and an organizer. We can see the traces of my grandfather's later characteristics in these early stories. Daring, bold, strong, impetuous, perhaps a little intimidating, an extremely hard worker, innovative, somebody who had nothing to lose and nothing to go back to. And that's what led me to conclude when he finally got to T-Ticket in East Falmouth in 1910, he found a home. And he settled out, made his stand, started his clan, and left his life pretty much back in the old country, completely behind. Until a snoopy grandson of his started digging around and see what he could find about those days of old, those days of yore. Now, the last thing I'm going to mention here is when I had done all this and made the presentation and connected a lot with family members, one night I had a dream. And in that dream, my grandfather came to me. Now, I barely remember my grandfather. I was 4 years old when he died in 1954. I really don't have much of an image of him in my head, but I knew it was him that came to me in this dream. And he was kind of looking down on me as I lay there, and he smiled at me. He said nothing, but he smiled at me, and he nodded his head. And then I woke up. And that's the conclusion of my story of Jose Moniz Katunta. Cue music.
Great story, Al.
Thank you. We got the music, Tim? This song is by the famous Cape Verdean singer. He's talking about longing for the days back in San Tome. She's talking about a Portuguese concept, a saudade. Saudade, which is a nostalgia, a longing for the old country. Bring it up a little more, Tim. Thank you, Tim. That's good.
Thank you so much, Al. Our, Falmouth, Alan Moniz. One thing I want to just jump on is how important these, for all the maligning that Facebook gets, these special interest groups, you join, and there's a bunch of people interested in focused topics that really can help hugely. And this San Miguel special interest group was just phenomenal. The number of volunteers that went through all these vital records and indexed them, put them into table form was just phenomenal. Just
Unbelievable amount of work they did.
yeah, just so great. And so
I would have been lost without a clue when I ran up to some of these roadblocks along the way.
right. So all you that have stopped using Facebook in disgust, just consider that there may be some good uses in these special interest groups. So, well, thanks all. We have, and the question is, does anybody want to ask Al something and so see if you can unmute yourself or raise your hand and I will unmute you. And we'll give you a shot at seeing if there's anything you'd like to say to Al. Okay, Chris. Oh, sorry. Hold on, Chris. There you go. Go ahead, Chris.
I love your story, Al. It parallels my family actually a bit.
Interesting.
My parents are Italian, and my father immigrated to the States right around the turn of the century too. And his father, Angelo, I've got to do the same thing. Look that up. But back to your cousin Miguel Moniz gave a talk in Woods Hole, and I'm sure you're familiar with that. And I love the story about the windows in St. Anthony's, because I got Bill Black said, "Hey, your name's in the St. Anthony's," and turns out Guido Poloni did those stained glass windows. And I really want to do a story because I didn't realize so many Portuguese immigrants came to the United States. I mean, they're in San Francisco, they're all over. Portuguese and Italians both immigrated to the turn of the century, and it's an amazing immigration. But at some point, I want to get together with you about the strawberry pickers and the laborers, the different people who worked in East Falmouth, and the tribute to them in the windows, because it's a tribute to each lifestyle, I guess. It's to the laborers in East Falmouth, or the industry people, whether you're a plumber, mechanic, landscaper, or whatever. The window is dedicated to that trade. So it's the tradespeople but I love your investigation. It's a great story. Thank you.
You're welcome. As I said before, that is not my area of expertise. If you can get a hold of Miguel, he's your guy. If you want to know about stuff that happens 1915 on. I mean, I know some stories about my grandfather being involved with the Strawberry Pickers Association. He apparently was treasurer. Of course, that makes sense. For early years with them. He was one of the original founders, and he was also one of the original guys that quit. He got fed up with them, and he quit and went off on his own. And sort of then became the leader of the independent growers. But one of the stories I heard was that at some point when he was tired of the middleman, he told his sons, take the boxes of strawberries and go to Falmouth Heights and just set up a table there on the sidewalk and sell them directly to the tourists. And they didn't want to do that. They were shy and intimidated, but my grandfather was way more intimidating than anything you're going to meet out there on the streets of Falmouth Heights. So they did it. and they sold out, you know, and he was getting a good price for it. So that's the kind of stuff I've heard stories about my grandfather doing.
You know,
I really look into that. I don't know why, but I've always been interested in those other years, those years before he came here.
no, I had heard the figure that in its heyday, the strawberry farms in Cape Cod were producing about 80% of the strawberry production for sales in all of Massachusetts.
I mean, the word industry is a good word. It's the proper word to use about that.
And also, isn't it true that of the Portuguese on Cape Cod, like the vast majority are in fact like Azorian or Cape Verdean, that they're island people
Well,
by far.
the first wave that I understand, you know, something happened early 1900, 1908, 9, 10, around there. Something happened in the United States where they passed a law that opened up immigration specifically to Portugal and the Azores, and perhaps Italy and a couple other countries. I don't know. But something happened that opened the door during that time period. And again, what I've read and seen is something to the tune of 90% of the people that you know with the names Rabisa and Souza or Soares, or let me think of some of the other ones.
Sylvia.
You know, on and on, Lopes. They're Portuguese in culture, but they're Azorian in specifics. They came from the Azorian Islands, which had a different flavor, which was its own entity in a way. And as a matter of fact, from that time period, a huge amount of the immigrants that came from the Azores came from San Miguel. Then later on, around the 1920s, the law changed, they shut it down. The Portuguese were considered, to be second-class kind of citizens and dirty and a bad element, and there was a reaction against immigration. It's kind of that dance that happens all the time. They need people, they need labor, they need cheap labor, they open it up. They don't like the people that are coming in, they close it down. Then they open it up and they close it down. In the 70s or 80s, I think it was, there was an earthquake on Terceira, one of the other Azorian islands, and they passed a law at that time, I think John Kennedy might have had something to do with it, to allow Azorians back into the country as kind of a refugee thing because of the earthquake had caused so much damage. So that's, if you want to get more specific, Cape Verdean is a smaller percentage of the people who came here. Vast majority were Azorian and San Miguelian, if you want to make up a word for it. The smallest amount were people from the mainland back in those days. The people from La Continenta, the people of the Azorians did not like and did not associate that much with the people from La Continenta. There was rivalry and, distrust between those two elements. My grandfather, Figueredo, was a rarity in those days because he did come from the continent. And when I found his passenger list, this is the last thing I'll say about it. Super interesting thing to me. I finally found him. I tracked down. I found his name. I found the town he came from in northern central Portugal, Silgueiros, from the wine country. I tracked across, and his destination. If you looked in the destination column, you'd see all the other Portuguese names above him and below him. And they were going to places like Taunton, Providence, Fall River, New Jersey, California. And next to my grandfather's name was Falmouth, Boston, Massachusetts. When my grandfather Figueredo came to this country, he came specifically and directly to Falmouth, Massachusetts.
So remember, people can, if you press your space bar, you can say something probably.
I want to say, when I was 8 years old, 1960, one of my best memories was strawberry picking on Cape Cod at Tony Andrews' farm. Was Tony Andrews Azorian or?
Cape Verdean, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
Cape Verdean.
You know, those also those people that, you know, are not from Falmouth Genealogical Society, if you are willing, I'd just be interested in hearing, how did you find out about this talk, this Zoom talk? Like Chris Poloni, how did you find out about this?
I'm a member. I get your emails.
Oh, that Chris. Yes. Okay. Jiminy Christmas. Yeah.
I've had the opportunity to work with Al for about 30 years, so we've been friends for a long time. So I was
That
very
long, huh?
interested to hear this presentation. Thank you, Al.
Thanks for attending.
Great. Well, okay, go ahead, Dottie. Press your space bar or something.
I'm just wondering if our speaker could move his camera a little so I can get a picture. I can't see his chin even.
Oh,
Yeah, now, if I stop talking, can I make him full screen then? Just for the newsletter. Sorry, I'm the
Okay, well, you can press, let me see, if he can say something and then you go to speaker view, you'll get just him. Does that help?
hello, 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 hello. Speaking. Picture. Cheese. How's that? I'll say cheese. Portuguese.
I did a screen capture earlier that I could share with you as well, Tim.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's true. And the other thing is there will be, this is all on live. We can capture frames from the live stream too, Dottie. All right, how about, is that it? Just next month on the website, you'll see we have Jill Morelli. And this was fun doing this the first time. And I hope the live stream worked. I'll find out. And I appreciate everyone joining. And thanks, Al, for all your effort going into this. You obviously had a lot of fun.
I love doing this stuff. It's like being a detective.
All right. Well, goodbye to all. I'll just watch you drop off and we'll join us next month if you'd like. Thanks very much.
Arrivederci.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
You're
Al.
welcome.
I think I
Thanks,
was
Al.
involved
Thanks,
when this was a
everybody. Great.
first idea. It's great.
Hi, Judy.
Hi, Al.
I'm getting individual people now on my screen. I'm going to say bye. I'm going to leave.
Okay, Al. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. Meeting.
Tim, I'm gonna message you the screenshot that I captured right now here on the chat area.
Great. Thanks very much. I'm going to, I'll close it out now. Okay. Thank you.